It's my absolute pleasure to have you here today. I have watched you on LinkedIn, or maybe stalked is the ideal term. I have stalked you a bit on LinkedIn and just seen some of your content and just how intentional I think it's is the word that comes to mind when I think of you. You're very intentional about what you share, and you are very knowledgeable. But before we even dive into the questions, I want you to kind of give us a brief run through. I know that you've had an incredible career as a BBC broadcast journalist. You have now transitioned into PR, but I almost want to hear from the source how that transition happened, how your career has taken shape. If you could just talk us through the journey here, that I think that would be really interesting to learn.
Yeah, sure. So I started my journalism journey at university. So I started writing for the student news website and then kind of really got the journalism bug, went and did an MA in journalism at Sheffield University, and also started doing huge amounts of work experience. I went a bit mad on the work experience because I was just so adamant this was what I wanted to do. I got a bit of work published in The Independent from my journalism dissertation, and that just really energized me in terms of the journalism career path I was going on. And I then went into local newspapers, so worked as a journalist there and really got a very solid grounding in news. I then went to BBC Southeast Today as a broadcast journalist, and all along I just had this niggle at the back of my mind that I would end up in PR. And I didn't know the term for PR then. I knew it was as press officer because as a journalist, that's what we understood. But just at the back of my mind, I was like, I'm going to work for a charity and I'm going to do PR. And I'm probably going to be in journalism for a few years before that happens to get that deep kind of understanding of how journalism works. And then I got a job at the Salvation Army and worked there for 9 years in their media team. I did regional and national, then went on to national media and did that for 9 years. And then from there, I started freelancing. I did freelance work for a PR agency working with not for profits, particularly in neurodiversity and special educational needs charities. And then I started working in B2B and got a real passion for businesses working in the environmental and sustainability space. And again, I think it sort of comes back from that charity background, that kind of purpose driven sort of feel that I have to what I do. So really got passion for that. And really it comes back to that sort of purpose driven business model
Mm.
that I just have a real passion for.
Mm. That is so interesting. So weird. As you were speaking, there were so many parallels, I think, to how I started my career. I quite
Mm.
liked what you said around, it was called a press officer then, and you didn't even know what PR was, but PR was something that you'd always wanted to do. And it's so interesting how sometimes we can't really articulate the goal or the vision, but we just know, and somehow like everything that you're passionate about, your purpose, your passion, you just continue to do the work and somehow you land exactly where you always intended to be. I find that so magical. So that sounds like such an interesting career, and I love what you said about how you are so driven for impact. And so you've sort of morphed your career in such a way that it's really all about like the impact, whether that's like sustainability or, it's a not-for-profit bodies. So that's really, really interesting. And moving into more like the business side of things and the dreaded capitalism.
Yeah.
um, what are the biggest misconceptions that businesses have about PR, especially when it comes to securing media coverage?
So I think there's two misconceptions that I
Mm,
see come up a lot. One of those is that PR is all about media relations. So all it
mm,
is working with journalists, and actually there's so much more to PR than that. I did a postgraduate diploma in PR, and one of the things we looked at was what is PR, and it came back to being about relationship building
mm,
and reputation management. And that obviously is much more than just media relations. So I would say, yeah, media relations is part of PR, but it's just one aspect of what someone who works in PR does. And I think the other is that you can kind of stop and start PR. So that's
Mm,
another misconception I've come across, and that, you know, from one article you'll get a flurry of leads, because actually
mm,
PR is much more about raising brand awareness, and you need that as a foundation for people to be able to trust you and to know you, and for you to be top of mind when they do come to a decision on what person they, you know, what business they're going to go for. So yeah, PR as a lead gen exercise
mm.
isn't quite how I would term it.
Yeah. No, 100%. And I quite agree with those misconceptions. We see it in our day to day all the time, having to really unpack that, especially for business owners who are so, I guess, focused on the bottom line and so focused, so laser focused on lead gen. It's so much more than that. As someone who's been on the receiving end of countless pitches as a journalist, what makes a story stand out to a journalist?
So there's two parts to this. I would say one, it absolutely has to be relevant to them and relevant to
Mm,
their audience. When I was in, you know, local news, we would get pitches that were for somewhere completely different in the
mm,
country, or with no reference to the local community, the local area. And that just really puts it in that sharp kind of contrast of, if you're not thinking about who you're pitching to and who their audience are, then you've kind of fallen at the first hurdle. And in terms of the, you know, the second is not being aware of the news agenda. Not,
mm,
if you go in with a pitch and there's no sense that it's newsworthy, you know, why should a journalist cover that? So it's really important that when you are pitching, that you are thinking about the news. What has this journalist covered before, that you could reference, or, you know, what's in the news that you could reference to kind of showcase why your media pitch is absolutely relevant for that moment in time.
mm. We've touched on some of the things that, businesses need to be thinking about when they're essentially pitching their news stories. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you've either come about or, I know you've just mentioned one with, sending news that isn't quite relevant to
Mm.
that journalist or that media outlet. What are some of the other mistakes that you'd say that people make when pitching to the media, and how can they avoid them?
Yeah, so in terms of the mistakes people make when pitching to the media, one of those is when people say, if a journalist has put out a request for interviews and you jump on it and actually you haven't got an interviewee ready or prepared or willing to do the interview. And sometimes PR people can do that, or marketers can do that because you
Yeah.
want to get the opportunity, but you haven't checked if anyone's free. And actually, that kind of can destroy the trust with that journalist, and they're
Mm,
less likely to kind of take your option over somebody else's if you haven't been able to deliver the goods. So that's a really big thing, is make sure you can actually do what you promise. And the other is just being super generic in your pitch. So if it's really just a bit boring, a bit bland, you're not willing to actually have an opinion on something, then a journalist is unlikely to want to cover that story. Journalists like there to be a bit of controversy, a bit of, someone having an actual opinion. So
mm,
as a business leader, that's something you really need to think about, is, do you have an opinion on a topic? And if so, that could be a good media pitch.
mm. Yeah, I think those are very, very good points that you've raised, because I smiled as you said the second one around actually making sure that spokespersons are available, because I've
Mm.
had to be the go between the PR agency and the spokesperson who wasn't available, and
Oh.
it was so uncomfortable, because I
Mm,
understood obviously the PR case for it, and that you want to make sure that you're not just building relationships, but you're also keeping those relationships warm with these
mm.
with the journalists. And it's never a good look when you finally get a yes and you just can't produce the spokesperson.
Yeah.
But also on the other hand, understanding the business case, in that, there's lots going on, there's so much activity, we just can't find the resources or the time to
Mm,
make an interview, and having to kind of be the diplomat in that exchange. It's not the nicest. But
Yeah.
but yeah, so I think that's really important actually is with PR teams making sure that there's actually I think what could also be useful is even having a sense of the availability of the spokespersons before actually going out and pitching some of these opportunities, because you never want to be in that place where you
Yeah.
finally got the opportunity and you just can't produce the goods for
Yeah,
lack of a better
absolutely.
way to put it. Another thing that really occurred to me, I think, as you were speaking is timing in the news cycle. Timing is everything in the news cycle. What is the best way to ensure that your pitch lands at the right moment?
Yeah, so, I would always say, pitch Monday to Thursday. I There's a bit of controversy about Fridays, and sometimes Friday can work, but I think Friday you just have to be aware that journalists are going away for the weekend or might be wrapping up for the week. So Friday is generally not the best day for media pitching. However, what you have to be aware of is the news agenda is changing constantly. And actually, if you have a media interview set up, say at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, you've got your spokesperson there, 5 minutes before you go on air, that interview could be cancelled because of a changing news agenda, because of something major that's happened in that industry, or just in the news generally. So the fact is journalists are just constantly faced with deadlines, and that's another thing to just bear in mind is if a journalist says to you, look, could you get an article to me by this deadline, and you then don't, you should really be managing that with the journalist, because you are acknowledging they have deadlines and there's a reason they've given you a deadline. It's because of a print run and things like that. So certainly bear that in mind as well.
Mm, mm. That's really useful. I think one of the things that you touched on really early on was around how PR really helps you to build out that brand awareness piece. I think another thing that is, very useful to know is also that to sustain that awareness, you have to be constantly build stronger relationships with journalists and really become their go-to sources for stories. So you almost move beyond that brand awareness piece now into then building thought leadership as you become the go-to source for stories that, are connected to your brand. How can brands do this? How can they build those relationships, keep those relationships warm with the journalists so that they are able to get to that point where they do become the go to sources?
So it comes back to being reliable. If journalists are offering you an interview or asking for a comment by a certain time, you meet those requirements and show willingness to help them, because that then will help them with their respect for you. The other thing about that, again, is around that kind of not having a stop start approach to PR, because
Mm,
if you do, say, a 6-month PR campaign, then stop it after that for a year, then come back to it a year later, those journalists may have moved on. They may well, your competitors may have kind of taken up the space you've left behind. And so they become the go to people. So it's that consistency. It's constantly kind of coming up with ideas for the journalists. So reaching out to them with ideas for stories, for interviews. So it's a bit of a two-way street. If they're coming to you and you can provide them with what they need, but also you're coming up with ideas yourself and offering them, then over time you become sort of that one of their trusted sources. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So keeping that momentum and not just building it and then stopping and hoping that you can come back to it a year from now when the news cycle has changed and competitors have probably leveraged that gap, and now it
Yeah.
becomes even harder to cut through the noise. Another thing that has changed, or another thing that is quickly evolving, is AI. And I know like there's two spectrums of this when it comes to like marketing and communications practitioners. Some of us are really excited about AI becoming a tool, and others are just like, oh my gosh, the dreaded AI. Where on that spectrum do you sit?
as you say, I think, AI is a tool. I don't think it
Mm.
should ever be the beginning or the end. But I think, and you have to be aware when using AI, it has its limitations as
Mm,
well. So if you're using AI to help you formulate a media pitch or an article, you need to be very aware that AI hallucinates, it can make up things. And
mm,
actually, you're in big danger of losing the trust of a journalist if you send them an article or a pitch with inaccurate or made up information in it. Because you can imagine if that journalist printed that and
mm.
their audience realized it wasn't true, there's a lot of repercussions there. So it's kind of, I would say, use AI, but use it with an intelligent approach, and with the knowledge that you and have built, and the experience you've built prior to that, to know, does this pitch work, is it accurate, and all those things that you would need to use anyway. So I think
Mm.
AI is a help, but it shouldn't be the beginning and the end goal.
Yeah, 100%. 100% agree with that. And with AI becoming so popular and AI generated content becoming so popular, I think another thing that is really changing very quickly in the media landscape is shrinking newsrooms. How should PR strategies evolve to stay effective against all of these changes and all of these evolutions and that are coming out with tools and technologies and again the shrinking newsrooms? How should PR strategies evolve to stay effective and agile against these quick rapid changes?
Yeah, so with that, I would say when I was a newspaper journalist, actually, that whole kind of shrinking newsroom kind of angle was going on then. We were
Mhm.
seeing journalists losing their jobs because newspapers weren't selling enough copies. And then Twitter came out, and I actually got my first front page through Twitter because I uncovered a murder, on someone talking about a murder that happened. So on Twitter. So it was,
I love how you say that so casually. Yeah, I uncovered a
yeah,
murder.
yeah, but so all I'm saying is these changes, social media coming in, shrinking newsrooms and things like that. That story has always been happening, and there's always going to be new technology. When I was a journalist, user generated content was starting to, people were filming things and we could use them, and it was like, wow, we can use this strange grainy video that someone filmed on their phone to illustrate a story. And that was all new and exciting then. And I think these things just, you constantly have to adapt and change and be willing to learn about new tools, about new social media platforms. For me, recently, well, in the last few years, really, LinkedIn has become massive in B2B and in that kind of thought leadership building space. So that's just one thing I would say. But I think with shrinking newsrooms, there's actually opportunity there. Yes, there's loads of PR people in comparison to the number of journalists, but I would say use it as an opportunity to provide fantastic articles, because actually, you can use that to, where journalists don't have time to write, who don't have as much time to create news stories. Actually, you have a lot of opportunity there to fill the space that they no longer can.
Mm, I think you created the premise for my next question, actually, when you talked about user generated content and
Mm.
the use of social media, and you gave that Twitter example. Social media has blurred the lines between traditional PR and influencer marketing. And I think you gave a fantastic example of how it's just really important that you stay aware of these new tools and technologies. And if anything, use that to leverage the work that you do and or enhance the work that you do. How else do you think that brands should be navigating this shift? Are there things, for example, right now, I love how you mentioned LinkedIn being very useful in B2B and building out that thought leadership space. Can you think of anything else that you think brands should be navigating in this shift?
Yeah, so I think you should be absolutely thinking of social media as part of your strategy. As I say, LinkedIn is absolutely fantastic for raising the kind of expert level of your business, showcasing your experts by their posts on LinkedIn, and sharing your media coverage on there. I think as well, it's about being aware that the media landscape has changed. So podcasts, people love listening to podcasts on their way to work or going for a walk and things like that. And podcasts have become a real, yeah, really important part of the PR kind of mix. And
Mm,
I would always be including podcasts when I'm doing pitches to journalists now. I think that, that's been quite a change. And I think it just goes back to really just being aware of what's changing. And actually, LinkedIn has less than places like Instagram, where you might have influencers promoting certain products and things like that. LinkedIn has done that. That's been less of a thing on LinkedIn. However, it's becoming more. And I have seen people sharing ads and things like that on
mm,
LinkedIn that they've been paid for themselves. So I think it's possible that may be, something we see more of, and it's worth keeping an eye on. The other thing to mention is video. Video is huge across pretty much all the social media platforms now, including LinkedIn. And we've seen, LinkedIn roll out their video feed. And as much as video does take more time, I find I have to redo my videos and all that kind of thing more so than I would my written posts. But it is clear that people like watching video. And again, you have to bear in mind things like people watch video on their phone. So actually, videos do better if they're in portrait mode than
mm.
landscape when it's on a social media platform. So those kind of things, it's just really worth being very aware of what's going on in the world, how people are accessing content and things like that.
I love that. I did not know that. I just made a note. Video does better in portrait on social media. And I think you're exactly right. We need to be thinking differently about channels and who is consuming and where they're consuming the content, and how we can make sure we're creating for these channels in a way that maybe we didn't have to 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And that's constantly changing, and we just need to stay abreast of these changes so that we are building strategy that is agile and that is relevant to the way that we're consuming content today. If a founder listening to this or a marketing lead wanted to start getting media coverage for their business but has no PR experience, where should they begin? What is the first thing that
So
they should be doing?
the first thing I would say is they need to find out what their ideal clients are reading, watching, listening to, so that as a very first point they know where they hang out, where they get that industry information. The second stage to that is then research. So read those outlets, listen to those podcasts, make sure that you have a real understanding of what gets coverage in those publications. Look at what your competitors are doing. Where have they been published? What kind of content are they publishing from those competitors? So you have a really good understanding of where you could fit into that picture.
I love that. Do you have a go-to framework for pitching, or do you just sort of build it on a case by case basis?
It is case by case, but first off, I would be thinking, what's the news angle here? And that would be sort of front and center that everything hangs off is, why should the journalist or why should their audience care about this pitch? And then
Mm,
I kind of build it out to sort of 3 bullet points that really highlight the free newsworthy angles. And ideally, I'd have some stats or figures or something in the news that I can hang off those bullet points from, so that it really just emphasizes to the journalist why they and their audience should care.
yeah, that sounds about right. Can you share, I guess, to my final question, just before we get to the rapid fire round, which is where, I love a long-winded response, but this is just, well, I'll ask you two random questions and you get to respond in one sentence. But just before we get to the rapid fire round, I was wondering, can you share a personal example of a pitch that absolutely nailed it? I'm really
Yeah, so
curious.
Yeah, so I was working with a client who was looking to kind of get coverage within financial services and within pharma, and they have had a lot around AI that they could talk about. So I found that the EU AI Act was coming out and basically did a pitch around that and their thoughts on the EU AI Act. And literally, we got coverage. I think it was around 10 thought leadership articles in,
Wow.
so five, it was something like five finance, five pharma articles on that topic. And it just, for me, that just showed if you know something's happening in the media and you know you can have an opinion on it, then go for it. And yeah,
Mm. Yeah. Talk about the best timing in the news
yeah,
cycle.
yeah.
Okay. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I feel like you've given very straightforward answers. It's like I was making notes. You're very knowledgeable, and thank you so much for sharing so much of your knowledge today and just not holding anything back and just being very transparent about the work that you've done for so many years. Thank you. Thank you for being so open today. Before we
No
close
worries.
off, I just want to quickly do the rapid fire round, which is my favorite. I'm going to ask you two random questions and you get to respond with the first thing that comes to mind. Don't overthink it. In
Okay.
one sentence. I don't think you'll struggle because
Okay.
you're not a long-winded. And I'm a really like I go on forever. You're just like okay, straight to the point.
Yeah.
So you're
Okay.
not going
Well,
to
we'll
struggle
see.
with this one.
Okay.
Okay. So my first question is, what is the one PR myth you wish would disappear forever?
So for me, that would have to be that PR is just media relations, just
Mm,
talking to journalists, and that's it. And kind of linked to that, actually, the kind of whole PR is fluff. That as a PR, you go to award ceremonies. It's all cute cats and kittens. When actually there's a huge amount of work, huge amount of strategy. If you're going to be effective, that needs to go behind that.
yeah, 100%. I think that's also my one PR myth I wish would disappear is that it is fluff and it's just like showing up and looking cute at events. It's so much work happening behind the scenes. So yeah, I agree. I agree with that one. My second question is this. If you could give just one thing not to do when pitching to journalists, what would it be?
It would literally be that saying you've got someone available or saying someone's willing to do an article and then not following through, just
Yeah.
because that just damages your relationship. It
Mhm.
just creates this kind of lack of trust. So for
Yes.
me, that's the number one. Do what you
Yes.
say you'll do.
Exactly. Do what you say you will do. I love that. And I think that's the perfect note to end our conversation on. Thank you so
Oh,
much, Rachel, for your time and just like, just being so open to doing this. Thank you. And I'm really excited to release it to the public and have everyone listen. I think it was a really, really, really useful episode. So thanks so
fab.
much for your time.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of it. So yeah, look
Yeah.
forward to listening.
Yes, I'm excited. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs smarter marketing insights. Until next time, I'm Moyo Kara.